So welcome to our humble little air museum here. So 2 days ago, we celebrated, honored, commemorated the 75th anniversary of certainly one of the most important military days in history, if not globally, not just the United States. The presentation is almost exclusively about the air and what air did, but I don't want any of us to slight or not remember all the sacrifices and courage of all the services that day. We're going to obviously focus about air. That's what we know, and that's what we're going to do. I'll share with you a story. My father, I think that's pertinent to that. My father was a career Marine Corps aviator. I was a career Air Force aviator, and for the longest period, we still talk every Memorial Day. And yet the conversation always includes talking to each other about, what it would have been like on the first wave hitting Omaha Beach, standing behind those doors of those Higgins landing crafts. How brave was that? What were they thinking? How did they, other than training and a focus, how was it that when those doors went down, charged they went? So I think that's real pertinent to what I just talked about. Here's two aviators, career military aviators, and we're talking about what the ground forces did on that day. So we'll all keep that in mind as we go talk about the air. Here's what we have planned for you today. And we're going to talk about the aerial preparation for and then the support for the landings on D-Day. We then have our Director of Maintenance, Trace, is going to come talk to you about what it's like to maintain a Mustang. And as you can see, our Mustang Man of War is undergoing the annual inspection right now. Okay, and then Ron Fleischman up in here, you can't miss him. He's got this really nice red shirt on. Okay, he's going to talk to you about the history of our airplane. And then I'm hoping most of you will join me. I'm going to do a walk around of the airplane, and we're going to talk about some other little factoids about the airplane I think that are very interesting to you. So we'll do that right after the formal presentation. Okay, let's get going. D-Day and the aerial support. So when you talk about the impact that the Allied aerial forces had on D-Day, you have to go back a year and a half, because the main impact that the air had was leading up to D-Day. And here's how it started. So all the way back to January of '43. So right after Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin got together and talked about what they talked about, the chiefs of staff and the important strategic planners for all of the Allied services got together and they came up with their plan. And it was called the Combined Bomber Offensive against Germany. And the air piece of that was called Operation Point Blank. And so you can see it's the portion of the CBO that was intended to cripple the Luftwaffe, especially their fighter forces. It began in mid-1943. So here's a year prior to D-Day where some of the key targeting and tasking of the air forces was all aimed at the coming D-Day. Eliminate the Luftwaffe. You can see the highest priority up there was the fighters and the fighter factories. That's what the photo is showing. So there's one of our heavy bombers attacking the Focke-Wulf factory. And another super critical factor to the success of D-Day was early in '44, Jimmy Doolittle, now a lieutenant general and the commander of the 8th Air Force. The 8th Air Force was where the heavy bombers were. He made he directed his fighters, stop being attached to the bombers, defensive. and go offensive. Go find the Luftwaffe wherever they are and kill them. And that was a critical directive, going from defensive, stay with the bombers, protect the bombers, to go offensive. Go find your targets and take care of them. Doesn't matter where they are, go find them. That rolls into Operation Jackpot. And that was the fighter sweeps now starting to focus more on northern France as we're getting closer to D-Day. It flowed and followed Operation Point Blank, and it was executed primarily by 8th Fighter Command, which was subordinate to Doolittle's 8th Air Force, and they had the mission of doing air superiority. So again, now start detaching from the bombers, let's go offensive, let's find the Luftwaffe, and let's achieve air superiority leading up to D-Day. Started in April, mid-April, so we're roughly a month and a half to 2 months from D-Day. Now we're getting even more serious about prepping for D-Day. The objective, lure the German fighters into the air or find them on their airfields and kill them. And that's going to overall degrade the capabilities of the German air defenses. Their main targets, you saw previous in Point Blank, we were really targeting the Luftwaffe factories, the German factories producing their airplanes. Well, they expanded those targets in mid to late May there to now start really targeting the transportation networks in northern France, i.e. let's stop the ability of those German second echelon ground forces from being able to impact the landings and our tentative beachheads once D-Day occurred. You can see the railways, the locomotives, rolling stock, and the all-critical German radars. If we backtrack 4 years, we saw how effective the British used radar in its infancy in the Battle of Britain. Well, the Germans were developing radar too, and by 44, the Germans had a very active radar network and were able to use it very well to vector their fighters into the oncoming Allied airplanes. So they started targeting those things. And throughout this, the P-51 excelled at all of these missions. The fighter mission, the fighter bomber mission, it was superior in all aspects. Okay, firepower too. So if you want to hear a little bit more about the firepower of Mustang, then come join me in this walk around and we're going to see it and we'll talk about it. It also, though, starting to do much more ground attack, the Mustangs, the losses of the Mustangs increased. Okay, so what were the results? Like I mentioned early on, the most impact that Allied air had on the success of D-Day occurred well before D-Day, up to a year prior. Okay, so they were able to achieve local air superiority over northern France. The Luftwaffe was unable to observe the massive preparations that were going on in southern England as it became a military camp, the entire southern part of England, getting all the vehicles and troops ready and the shipping. And then there was little Luftwaffe opposition on the morning of D-Day to the actual landings, all because of the previous year and all of that air effort to degrade the Luftwaffe. Here is a key kind of statistic. So if I can explain those a little bit. In February of 44, there was this thing called Big Week, and that was this massive aerial attack over all of occupied, so not just D-Day focused, but still hitting the strategic targets going into Berlin. But at that, for February, the statistics that Allied Air Forces had was of all their losses, all of them, 61% came from Luftwaffe fighters. That same kind of statistic in June of 44, it had dropped to 31% came from Luftwaffe fighters. So that's a hugely significant statistic and showing the degradation of the German fighter force. Adolf Galland was a well-known and very famous German fighter pilot, and here's his quote that I kind of talked about earlier. When Doolittle told all the fighters, detach from the bombers and go offensive. You can see what a key German fighter pilot said about that. At that point, it was clear that the air war was lost from the German perspective. So here is a bit of an eye chart. I apologize. I purposely kept it kind of large scale. So here you can see as all the shipping, so here the southern part of England is just a massive military camp. So here's where all the shipping is converging, coming down this corridor. Those three hashed areas are areas of fighter cover, where they put up a whole bunch of Allied fighters to cover the shipping. Over here, this is the ingress route of the C-47s. Those darker red kidney-shaped things are where they dropped the paratroopers, and then they went out this way and back up. And here are the British. The British also had paratroopers, and they came down this way and dropped here. And notice how if you can come up to the legend, this dark red oval up here is where they dropped our paratroopers. And notice they're on the flanks. Okay, here's your tactical recce, is this red line. So tactical recce, and that was done primarily by Spitfires and the Royal Air Force Mustangs. They were flying what we called P-51As. The British called them Mustang 1s. We'll talk about that too if you join me in the walk around. But all this TAC recce, you know, they had for weeks been photographing the beaches, and now they're photographing all of these German second echelon ground forces. Where are they, and what are their transportation means? How are they going to get to the beachheads? Here's some higher elevation photo recce, and I kept it. If you can see all these red dots, and why I didn't blow up the slide a little bit, all of these red dots are key railway intersections. And those, as we saw earlier, were critical targets for the Allied air forces to try and interdict and destroy leading up to D-Day to make it harder for those German reinforcements to affect the beachheads. So now here's the actual D-Day, June 6th. And what did air do on D-Day? Well, they had a three-phase approach. They continued with the objectives of Operation Point Blank and Operation Jackpot and destroy the Luftwaffe. Find them and kill them. They then wanted to interdict the road and rail networks, as we just kind of highlighted. Let's keep the second echelon and all those very elite armor divisions out of our way until we have the beachhead and we can break out of the beachhead. And then the actual battlefield interdiction and what they called at the time direct air support, we now these days call it close air support. And that's direct communication from airplanes and troops on the ground. What's your target right now? What's hassling you? And let's go take care of it for you. The weight of effort, still to this day, the D-Day aerial operation is the largest aerial support in history. About 13,000 Allied airplanes took part on this one day, and the total, they flew almost 14,000 sorties on one day. I focused here, these next statistics, on the fighter and fighter bomber squadrons. So there were 171 squadrons that were tasked to support, and you can kind of see these are squadrons. So that's 15 squadrons did shipping cover, 54 did beach cover, and the others were doing bomber escort and offensive fighter sweep. Offensive. Let's go offensive. So that is about 100 squadrons of fighters and fighter bombers dedicated to air. Let's find the enemy air and kill them, or keep them off our guys. These others down here, that's about 70 that were dropping bombs, either doing the interdiction for the networks, the road and travel networks that the Germans were going to use, or direct air support on the beach. We'll get to see how some of those numbers stacked up against what the Luftwaffe was able to put up that day. So here are some of the key Allied airplanes that participated in the that day. And I have, when you see an aircraft in red out here, I've highlighted because we have an example out here on the ramp, and you can take a look at when we're done with our presentation. So the good old C-47. Eisenhower loved this. After the war, he said it was one of the most important weapons of the entire war. 832 of these airplanes participated in the night of June 5th and early morning of June 6th, flying paratroopers in. And they dropped about 23,000. That's both U.S. and British. 23,000 troops were dropped onto the flanks of the Normandy coastline. The gliders as well. C-47s had the task of not only dropping paratroopers, but also towing gliders. So here's a picture of one. The most common of the day was the CG-4, and their mission was they had additional troops, so those are reinforcements that were brought in. They also had resupply. They brought in some equipment. Jeeps were heavily brought into the area. And interesting enough, at this time, at least on D-Day, they were considered expendable. So they drop them, the glider pilot puts them down in their fields, the troops and supplies and equipment get off, and we forgot about them, and we left them. And here's a picture, if you can make it out. This almost looks like the Battle of Britain going on up here, but that's C-47s towing their gliders. So here's another glider with its C-47 off the photograph. You can see them all in a row, the C-47s bringing in the gliders. And down here, and let's see, even back up in here, you can see the gliders in their fields after their landing. Sometimes it didn't go very well. So that one looks like it had a quite an exciting landing right there. Here are the medium bombers, A-20s, B-25s. There are two B-25s out on the ramp for you guys to take a look at if you're interested. And the B-26, a couple photos right down there. And this is my opinion, as I formed my opinion preparing for this, was on D-Day, the medium bombers were kind of the aerial stars of the day. The fighter guys had done their work in the preceding year. But on D-Day, it was the medium bombers. The heavy bombers, the strategic bombers, they also got rolled in to drop and hit targets in northern France. But there was weather, just like there was today down in Zamperini, that affected our mission today. There was weather, and the strategic bombers stayed above it. A lot of them did not drop their bombs. Those that didn't do very well as far as striking their targets. But the medium bombers stayed low, and they stayed low under the weather, and they went directly after bunkers and pillboxes and artillery that was close up to the beachhead and directly putting ordnance on our troops on the ground. So in my opinion, on D-Day, these were the aerial stars of the day. Low-level visual attacks. There were a lot of reports coming back from the bombers that they were fragging themselves. So when you're dropping bombs, there are two considerations that you have when you set up your bomb and your attack parameters. One is safe escape. So that is, when that bomb comes off your airplane, you want the bomb in still an inert fashion. It's not armed yet, until it is safely away from your airplane. And now the fuse arms and it's ready for impact. The other aspect is called safe separation. So after you have safe escape of the bomb, right, the bomb is going to trail you, because as soon as that bomb leaves your airplane, gravity takes over, it starts to drop, and your airplane is still moving forward. Well, when the bomb hits and explodes, it has think about a semicircular frag pattern where all this fragmentation of the bomb is. And you need your airplane outside of that. Well, a lot of these bombers, you know, they were focused on supporting their ground troops. And I have to put my bomb into that machine gun bunker right now. And they were finding that they didn't have safe separation because they dropped so close to their targets that that bomb went off before they were outside of the fragmentation envelope of that weapon. So a lot of them were getting fragged from their own bombs. And the point is, that's the level of effort that they went to support the guys on the ground. And they were attacking and destroying targets that were critical to those guys on the troops on the ground. And here come the fighters. So what were the fighters doing? You can see some critical ones, okay, up there. We have a P-47. We have a P-47 right back there that we are just starting to restore. I put the photo up because that's not quite out on our ramp yet. But P-38s, the Typhoon, that was a Royal Air Force airplane. That thing excelled and was just extremely effective against the second echelon of the German army as they were moving to take care of us. You know, about 3,200 operational airplanes, fighters and fighter bombers, were available and tasked. That's a huge number. We'll see a slide that emphasizes that in just a minute. So you can see their missions. They were doing the cover we talked about, shipping, beach, bomber cover. They were doing interdiction, direct air support. And what really shone on this day was the versatility of the fighter bombers. So this airplane would carry bombs, and in that way, if its target, if its mission of the day was to go drop on a railway, it was a fighter bomber. And the versatility and the tactics that the fighter bombers employed were much more effective than the strategic and even the medium bombers, who were kind of doing their, I'm in formation, I'm just going to do a straight and level pass over these targets and drop our bombs. Well, the fighter bombers were more maneuverable and could pinpoint road intersections and bridges, and were found to be very, very effective. Kind of the birth of the real role and impact of a fighter bomber. Some of the priority targets. There's a photo of one of those massive bunkers that's right on the beach, right on the bluffs over the beach, that a lot of those medium bombers had to take care of because our heavy bombers just couldn't hit them. We talked a lot already about the transportation network. Another photo down there, you see an airplane pulling off in the top right, and he's hitting a railway. And they are destroying railways and key road intersections to make it so much more difficult for the German army to move forward. German second echelon, any and all vehicles, and here are a couple examples. The German Panzer Lehr Division was an elite German armored division with some of their most advanced Tigers and the other targets, or sorry, the other tanks. And a quote from their commander was, it was like a fighter bomber race course, i.e. as they were moving forward, they were under constant attack by Allied airplanes. And here's an SS armored division that was tasked to move forward and try and push us back into the sea. And in his book, The 13 Great Battles of World War II, author Henry Mall said that division just disintegrated under aerial attack. So now let's talk a little bit about the Luftwaffe as we talk about what were the primary threats to not only the air operations, but also our ground threats. Okay, as we mentioned, let's go back to Operation Point Blank and Operation Jackpot. The Luftwaffe lost over 2,200 pilots. So double that as for the number of airplanes they lost. But more critical, these are their experienced, combat savvy veterans, and they've lost over 2,200 of them in that 5 months. So on D-Day, they had 80 to 100 operational fighters. Who remembers how many operational fighters we had? 3,200 against 100. There are about 90 operational bombers available to them. Now, as I went through my research, you know, there's a huge difference of opinion between all the historians and the armchair generals about how many sorties did the Luftwaffe actually put against our landings that day. You know, I saw anywhere from 90 to 100 up to over 300 sorties flown by them. So it's up to your opinion, right, at this point. My belief or the opinion I formed was they probably flew sorties that they tried to fly against our invasion, probably upwards of 200 that really mattered. And here's a graph that I showed that they tried. So this is Luftwaffe response on June 6th. And you can see a lot of them got turned back around by our Allied fighters. So that's where I talk about a low success rate. So they may have flown upwards of 300 sorties, but of those, how many of them impacted or how many of them got to the beaches or our mass convoys of ships was much, much less. Okay, total aircraft losses of all the Allies, we had 127 that were lost to all causes, not just fighters, but flak and operational. If you fly an airplane into the ground, that's a loss. That was less than 1%. The Luftwaffe, about the same. But it doesn't paint the mission success of the two different sides. And that's really illustrated a lot by this. A lot of these sorties that the Luftwaffe put up were unable to complete their mission because of Allied air cover. So here's that schematic I talked about. 3,200 operational Allied fighters against 80 to 100 operational Luftwaffe fighters. So here's the Focke-Wulf over here, and this is what's going to greet him. So we go back to Operation Point Blank and Operation Jackpot, and that's where Allied Air made their money. Okay, the other threat, very, very real, certainly after the fact, was friendly fire. You can imagine all of the surface and ground defenses of our own wanting to protect their troops from enemy air, and we painted D-Day stripes. So here's a decent illustration up here, and that's what this, you can see the D-Day stripes that were painted on all the airplanes, not just the fighters, and that was for VID. You see the D-Day stripes, it's friendly. So this map shows from D-Day up to the 12th of June. Here's kind of the breakout of there's Utah Beach, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword, and all of the land force, how they divvied it up. The darker blue lines in here are the beachheads, Utah, so at the end of June 6th. Pointe du Hoc was considered Omaha, so you can see a very small beachhead on Omaha, and better over here in the British and Canadian. They made better movement on D-Day. The red line here is 6 days later, so June 12th. And I liked this slide and brought it because if you look at some of the German division movements, this guy here, may be hard to read, sorry, that says 12 to 19 June. So it took them that long to get up here. Here's the Panzer Lehr Division, 4 days before they were able to close with the Allied ground troops because of the interdiction. Constant harassment, trying to move. They had to start moving at night only, because if they moved during the day, they were sitting ducks. Remember that fighter bomber race course? So here comes a flight of 4, and they just set up a race course. Attack, attack, attack. Then the next 4 come in. Attack, attack, a race course. I also find it very interesting. I think most of us know how tough it was on Omaha Beach on D-Day, but on the breakout, look who made the most movement. Look who made the most ground once they got off the beachhead. Let's watch a video.
By mid-1944, the lessons of the Italian campaign were adopted by the other Allied tactical air forces. During the invasion of France in the summer of 1944, those skills and methods soon created the most effective tactical air campaign in the history of warfare.
Our first job was interdiction, of the rail lines and the airfields and all that kind of stuff. And canals and barges and anything that moved, we clobbered, and we'd go on lots of missions over next to Germany and into Germany even, where we'd fly in high, escort the bombers in, the B-8th Air Force bombers, and then hit the deck and come home shooting things up, on the way home.
The RAF's 2nd Tactical Air Force joined forces with the American 9th Air Force, commanded by the irrepressible Pete Quesada, to execute the pre-invasion air plan. Using Hawker Typhoons, the RAF ravaged German radar sites along the coast. De Havilland Mosquitoes flew low-altitude pinpoint raids on key installations. Spitfires and RAF Mustangs conducted on-the-treetops reconnaissance, photographing the invasion beaches from as little as 25 feet. Simultaneously, the 9th Air Force undertook Operation Chattanooga Choo-Choo. Hundreds of American P-38s and P-47s prowled the skies over western France, searching for trains. When they found a train or locomotive, down they'd swoop to shoot them to pieces with cannon, machine guns, rockets, and bombs.
It was very dangerous to be in any train, because I think the Allied fighters must have had orders to shoot at any train that was on any track. And I think after the war was over, the assumption proved to be true, because there were locomotives standing all over the place that were all shot to pieces.
In one stretch of attacks in the last week before D-Day, over 800 locomotives were destroyed by the fighter bombers. As the fighter bombers demolished the Third Reich's rolling stock, the B-26 Marauders of the 9th Air Force pounded away at rail yards and bridges.
Being a tactical aircraft, our targets were essentially anything that would hold up the Nazi capacity to move divisions, to move artillery, to move anything. So our missions were essentially railroad bridges, railroads, ammunition, refineries, bridges, tactically anything that could keep them. And toward the end of the war, where the Germans had been able to move a division in a matter of a day or so, they couldn't move that division in 2 weeks.
By June 1st, 1944, their efforts had reaped huge rewards. Of the 27 bridges over the Seine that had been targeted, 24 had been destroyed and the other 3 severely damaged. Rail traffic in western France had been reduced to a crawl. As Allied air power destroyed Germany's rail, sea, and river corridors, the Wehrmacht grew increasingly reliant on vehicle convoys to deliver supplies to the front. But as D-Day approached, even these would soon be ravaged by the men of attack air.